Hello, welcome everybody to another symposium. Of course, like all symposia these days, we are doing a Zoom-posium or a Zoominar or a webinar, whatever the term of art you would choose to call this. Today's topic is a topic that I'm sure each one of us can feel very personally and very viscerally. And in fact, we're experiencing it right now, which is making a connection with others through the digital ecosystems. And our conversation today is about the state of the digital ecosystem here in the United States. And in particular, the extent to which there is a divide in that ecosystem, and how can we turn that divide into a digital dividend. And we'll have an opportunity to reflect on the state of the divide and really how divided we are about how big that divide is. I'm Bhaskar Chakravarti. I'm the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I lead a research initiative called Imagining a Digital Economy for All, or IDEA 2030. This is a research initiative that is supported by the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. And we have been conducting a study of how technology is serving us and whether it is serving us and how can it serve us better. And the extent to which technology is a multiplier or a divider, and the extent to which we can push the needle towards multiplication rather than division. So lots of really topical, important issues here. And of course, these issues are sufficiently complicated that we needed to dig into our own wells of research in order to gain some insights into the state of digital divide and potential dividends. But that was not enough. We needed to go to the smartest minds on this planet to get help on an understanding of the problem and potentially a sense of the solutions that that might be within reach. So in order to help us reflect on the problem and reflect on the solutions, I'm thrilled to have some absolutely phenomenal colleagues, and a couple of them are in our own neighborhood. I'm speaking from Boston, and in Vermont, just north of me, is Sue Halpern, whose writings I'm a keen follower of in the New Yorker, as I'm sure several of you are as well. And Sue has been writing on the topic of the digital divide, for a while, and we have a lot to learn from her writing and her research. I'm also joined by another neighbor in another state north of us, in Maine, Shoshana Zuboff, who gave us two very important words that define the state of the digital industry today: surveillance capitalism. Shoshana has written several books, and her most recent book, interestingly, it was described as the Das Kapital of the digital age, on surveillance capitalism. And I would love to ask Shoshana about how the digital industry itself could help us try and close the digital divide. I'm also joined by my colleague from the Brookings Institution, who heads the governance studies at Brookings and leads the major think tank's work on technology policy. And he is in Washington, D.C., so he's got his mouth close to the ears of the administration, Darrell West. And so across the three of them, we have a phenomenal array of expertise to draw upon. And we'll also be joined by Miguel Gamino from MasterCard, who heads up MasterCard's city initiative. So we'll have some perspectives on how connectivity in the urban infrastructure, in particular the payments infrastructure, is playing a role in the digital divide. And prior to his role at MasterCard, Miguel was also the Chief Technology Officer for New York. So he has some very interesting perspectives to bring in from there. So just a quick, a few housekeeping rules. Your video, all of you who are participating as an audience in order to conserve bandwidth, speaking of the digital divide, your videos have been kept off. If we could ask you to keep your mics on mute as well. Please post your questions on Q&A. We welcome questions. We'd love to get to all your questions. Those we cannot get to in real time, we'll get to afterwards. So do let us know where we can reach you. A recording of this entire webinar, including all the slides that we shared, will be available on our website shortly. And please join the conversation on social media on hashtag IDEA 2030, IDEA 2030. And with that, let us get going. So I will kick this off with a few uh, pages that I'd like to share with our audience um, in order to set the table. So let me get to my visuals, and here we are. So here's our topic: turning America's digital divide into digital dividends. And I say this while being conscious of the fact that the term digital divide is something that we have been hearing about quite a lot in connection with how we have spent the last 12 months using the digital economy as a proxy, as a stand-in for the real economy. And the state of the digital infrastructure and our use of it has been laid bare by the pandemic, which continues to make its way through our lives and our livelihoods. As I mentioned, I have two colleagues right here north of us, and I thought I would share with them what their neighborhood looks like in terms of how their neighbors are using technology today. And so here is the state of Vermont in a very, Vermont is of course a mountainous state, and the mountains that you see here they're a little bit different from the mountains that you would see if you were to travel to Vermont. So the high points here are the population centers of Vermont, and the greenness of Vermont, which of course, if you visited Vermont, you know that it's green all over. However, if I were to color code the state using access to and usage of broadband internet, the greenness tends to fade as you go away from the population center. So you can see, there's kind of one and a few other counties that are somewhat green, and then there are other parts of Vermont that are less so. Another view of the picture of the digital divide in Vermont can be seen through a different, somewhat of an analytical construct that looks very complicated, but let me just sort of break this down for you. So one of the arguments that we make in our IDEA 2030 work is that the divide comes in the form of course, it comes in the form of access and infrastructure, and who has access to a fast internet connection, and who has access to a smartphone, and so on and so forth. So infrastructure is important. We look at a number of different factors associated with infrastructure: internet speeds, terrestrial broadband coverage, usage of smartphones, but there are other ways in which we are divided. For instance, institutions. What are the policies and regulations and laws in a given part of the country, and how do they support access to high-speed internet? And then in addition to institutions, we are also looking at affordability and inclusion. We recognize the fact that in theory, it might be possible for everybody to get to the internet somehow. But it could cost an arm and a leg to just download your child's school homework. And that may not be worth the trade-off for many people. And for many people, what they have done is, instead of doing it at home, they've had to drive their child to a parking lot of Taco Bell in order for them to download their homework over the past 12 months. And then one more dimension that we cover, which is looking at it from the consumer side. We recognize that just having a pipe coming into your home, whether it's a wireline or a wireless pipe, is not enough. There's information that's coming through it. And how good are we, how proficient are we in processing that information? And we all know that the processing of that information has also been quite troublesome. A combination of the fact that we are still somewhat new to receiving our messages and news and information over the internet. There's a lot of news that's been coming through, and it's quite confusing. And the fact that there's a lot of misinformation that is coming through the system as well. So we measure digital proficiency in different parts of the country. And we have looked at a number of different factors that help us get a handle on the degree to which populations are proficient in absorbing and interpreting the information, whether it's demographic information or information about their education levels or their political affiliations and the extent to which they rely on social media for news, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of different factors that we look at. And one of the messages I would like to carry across this webinar is that we are deeply divided across this country on all these factors, depending on where we live. Now, state of Vermont is a mountainous state. The state of Maine is also got it's got a very craggy coast, and you can see that the state of broadband internet usage in Maine is just as variable as it is in Vermont. And just as a point of comparison, on the other side of the country is the state of California, and this is what California looks like. And one of the things that's striking to me is that the thing that looks like the World Trade Center or whatever the new tall building that has replaced it is called, is San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, the home of the internet, or at least theoretically, its neighborhood is the home of the internet. And one point I'd like you to take away is that it is not the darkest green. And in fact, many parts of urban California are not using the internet at speeds that would allow you to get on a Zoom call and stay on it. About 15 million people in urban California are not using the internet at broadband speeds. However, don't despair, there's help at hand. If you were not attending this webinar, you were probably attending a webinar that's being hosted by a competition that we don't want to compete with, which is President Biden. And President Biden is releasing his $3 trillion infrastructure plan. And there it is. His part of his infrastructure plan is he is asking for a lot of money. And one of the line items there is $100 billion to help close this digital divide. He is announcing that as we speak. One of the messages that I'd like all of you to take away from this conversation is that $100 billion seems like a lot of money, but it is not enough, because the real amount is closer to $240 billion that will be needed to close the gaps that we are talking about today. And so that's the Build Back Better message meets reality, but this is part one. Part two, Build Back Better meets reality, part two, when it meets Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. So we can ask for a lot of money. It's not necessarily the case that we're going to get it. That said, it's important to figure out how much money to ask for. So with that bit of table setting, let me stop sharing my screen and ask Sue Halpern. You live this digital divide, given that you live in Vermont. You study the digital divide. You also have observed that the digital divide is there for economic reasons, but it's there for political reasons as well. Can you help us understand and interpret why in the country that has invented the internet still has such a big and deep digital divide?
I think the first thing that we have to think about is privatization. The internet has been essentially captured by large corporations, telecom corporations, whose main interest is in their shareholders and not in the public good. And so, when you have very low return on investment in places like Vermont or Maine, or even, parts of cities where people can't afford your infrastructure and your costs, you don't build there. And so I think, that's where we went wrong just from the beginning. I think that no one sort of recognized that this would be more like a utility and less like your telephone. And so I think that's where we started there, and we're still there. And almost everything that's wrong with this situation can be traced back to that. We see very bad mapping from these companies that take money from the federal government, saying that they are serving a particular census block when they might have one user in that census block, but it goes into the mapping as if everyone there has it. We see these very, very high prices, so much higher than anywhere else basically in the world. And that means that a lot of people can't afford it to begin with. And then, we have problems like we have here, where the infrastructure to begin with isn't adequate because it's not being served by these companies. And once it's not being served by these companies, then you're kind of in a bad place, as we are right here. We can't have fixed wireless because there are no telephone poles, no utility poles coming up our mountain. And it's too expensive to put the utility poles in. If they were there, we might be able to have it, but we can't. So, I'm going to trace it back to this particular problem of privatization that I think potentially with this $100 billion, I mean, one of Biden's arguments is that they're going to privilege nonprofits and electric co-ops and other kinds of co-ops and community-based organizations that potentially could provide service at a cheaper cost in the long run. So, you know, maybe that $100 billion isn't enough, but maybe it's better than we think it is.
Absolutely. So $100 billion, we'll take it any day if Mitch McConnell, obviously not Senator McConnell alone, but Congress, decides to pass it. I'd like to ask you one follow-up question, and then I'd like to pick up on the point that you made about privatization, Sue. So one follow-up question is, and you've written very evocatively about the rural broadband gap. And you also had commented in a conversation that we had earlier that this is not just a rural problem alone. And we see broadband deserts in the middle of cities, in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in New York City. Can you say a little bit more about that? Why are we always focusing on the rural part of it, whereas there are many more people in cities who don't have access to the internet?
So yeah, then well, that's in part because there are many more people who live in cities, right? I mean, let's start there. And then I would also just argue as a rural person that we don't know in terms of the affordability gap, how it really affects rural communities because they don't have the opportunity even to not pay for it because they can't afford it. So let's, do that. But the fact is that it's extremely expensive. And when you have, to make a choice between, are you going to pay your rent or are you going to pay, AT&T, you're going to pay your rent. So let's, start there. The federal government had a program called Lifeline, which was intended for low-income families to get some subsidies for broadband, or at least for internet, let's call it that, which in the previous administration basically kneecapped it. It's basically, half the number of people are now receiving Lifeline funds than they were under President Obama. So, even these kind of minimal attempts that we've made to bridge this divide because of affordability are getting limited, more and more limited. So there's that problem, but it's a money problem. A lot of this is a money problem. We haven't really had the wherewithal to solve this money problem. As the federal government is never really that interested in poor people. So, we have that going, that is also a problem. But overall, again, I'm going to come back to these very high-priced services. A lot of people can't afford them. And I'd also say that when the original digital divide concept was put out there into our zeitgeist, into our vocabularies, it was about affordability. It was about the fact that you could be in Manhattan, on 96th Street and Park Avenue and have perfectly good internet, and you can go 20 blocks north of there and no one has it because they can't afford it. So that's
great. So thank you for kind of setting the table so nicely for us, Sue. And I'd like to kind of pick up on 2 points that you made now. And I'd like to turn to Shoshana for her observations in helping us connect those 2 points. One point you made was privatization. So this is we have certainly discovered over the course of the last 12 months that the internet is kind of like the fire department. We all need it. You can't do without it. So how come the fire department is not privatized, at least? So how come access to the internet is? So if we do have private companies that are providing us, digital technology, on the one hand, the second problem that you raised was it's a money problem. Now, the federal government is not very keen on opening up the purse strings, despite the trillions of dollars that are being released. There are many competing, demands for them. So one thing that strikes many of us is that the technology industry actually has a lot of money, because it's the one industry that's done extremely well over the course of several years, and certainly the last year has gone extremely well from a money perspective. The technology industry is also in the crosshairs of regulators and the government. The technology industry, and when I say technology industry, it's broadly writ, but mostly the companies that have been hauled up in front of lawmakers in recent months. Is there a potential connection between the money that the technology industry has? Could that become part of? And you mentioned the telephone model. In the telephone era, there used to be something called the Universal Service Fund, where you would have the long distance carriers. They would essentially be required to provide access to everybody in exchange for maintaining a monopoly. Now, we're not asking for a monopoly situation here, but is there a model that could be applied? And Shoshana, you have spent so much of the recent years sort of talking about the technology industry and its impact. And I'm wondering whether there's any connection that you see about the role that they could play in addressing the digital divide and closing the gaps that Sue was talking about. I think we need to unmute Shoshana. There you go.
Absent-minded professor, always was one, always will be one. Thank you, Bhaskar. Great to be here with you and Sue and Daryl. Such an important topic. I want to begin with the idea of build back better. And my concern here is that the Biden administration, in which we are all placing our hope for the near-term future, I think we're missing an important dimension of what it means to build back better. And Sue's comments really set us up for this. It is a money problem, but even more specifically, it's a profit problem. And drilling down into that one more layer, it's an economic model problem. So right now, let's just imagine for a moment that we could fix the digital divide and all of those orange and yellow places on the map and red places on the map could suddenly be green. We still have a problem, and I'm going to illustrate it this way. In March 2020, just as the pandemic was breaking out around the world, there were 40 million global users of Google Education, its principal suite of education tools for remote learning, remote classrooms, 40 million. Today, there are 150 million users of Google Education. UNESCO recently predicted that there are 2 billion students around the world who need remote education facilities. So that's the breadth of the market. Now, what those 150 million users, the parents, the children, the teachers, the school administrators, what most of them do not know is that in February 2020, just a couple of weeks before the pandemic became global reality, the Attorney General of the state of New Mexico in the United States of America, the Attorney General Hector Valderas, filed a class action suit on behalf of the state against Google, specifically against its educational tools. Why? Because his investigation uncovered, and by the way, in New Mexico, 60% of the schools were using these Google tools. His investigation uncovered that despite the fines that Google has had to pay for these infractions in the past, despite its pledges, that in fact, Google Education was aggressively data mining young children, students of all ages, not only data mining them and profiling them, but doing it across devices, across domains, online and offline, in an extremely aggressive and pervasive manner. And this is what I call surveillance capitalism, because Google gives away these educational tools and many other services, and indeed even hard products like Android, always priced very low. And the reason is that the real business here is the data mining business. It's scooping up behavioral data from people without their knowledge, using those data for analysis and ultimately for sales. That's where the money that you're talking about is coming from, Bhaskar. That's where the market capitalizations, the trillion-dollar market capitalizations, especially of companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook, are coming from. So right at the moment that we look like we're sort of, making progress against the digital divide and getting these tools out to a lot of people, right at that moment is the moment when we are capturing these people, especially now students, the most vulnerable among us, and scraping them with this extractive economic logic, which is the cause of many ill effects in our society. The cause of the wholesale destruction of privacy, the cause of disinformation and misinformation as a societal scourge, and the cause of the increasing unaccountable power and dominance of these companies, illustrated quite recently in Australia, where Facebook initially reacted to the idea of having to pay for news by simply shutting off its services in that country. That's dominance of critical infrastructure, unaccountable power. So we have a nest of problems here, Bhaskar. We want to build back better. And building back better means that we take this profit equation out of it. We recognize that we're talking about critical infrastructure now. We're talking about something more in the line of running water and electricity than we are talking about high-level services that only wealthy people can afford and can use and prosper with. So we're talking about critical infrastructure, and we're also talking about critical infrastructure which is right now poisoned with an extractive economic logic that has a range of destructive consequences for society, for individuals, and for democracy. So building back better has to encompass all of these dimensions. And I was extremely heartened by the congressional hearings last week. I'm sure some of you listened to them, where for the first time, really, we're seeing our members of Congress speaking directly to the problem, saying this is about an economic model that is driving for profit at the expense of people, society, and democracy, and it will be held accountable. So we are beginning to have a critical mass in Washington ready to comprehend, to grasp, and to move on these issues. Build back better is a once in a decade, perhaps once in a century opportunity to put all these pieces together and put them front and center in our agenda to create a democratic digital future. This is at the heart of our failing, Bhaskar, because we haven't evolved a vision and a design approach and a protocol and a deep understanding of what it means to have a democratic digital future. We've left a void, and it's surveillance capital that has filled that void, leading to this dead end of privatization and surveillance profiteering that is now the poison pill at the center of this digital divide controversy.
Yeah, so Shoshana, I wouldn't have expected any less in terms of a very powerful articulation of the challenges that, as you just mentioned. And I guess one of the things that we struggle with is there's a large set of complicated issues regarding surveillance capitalism and the role that the technology companies are playing, which is a topic for almost another seminar, another webinar. As we reflect on the presence of those players, Google is not going to go anywhere. Google is going to be a part of our lives. And at the same time, we recognize that the Build Back Better plan right now is asking for $100 billion, which our own team is saying is not enough, because the real ask should be $240 billion. And regardless of whether it's 100 billion or 240 billion, Congress is not going to pass either of those numbers because Congress has other fights to fight. So I guess the question is, what does Joe Biden do? What would you recommend? And when I say you, I turn to you, Shoshana, and you, Sue, for your ideas on how they can build back better in recognition of the reality, both the congressional reality, the political reality, and the capitalist reality, as it were.
Well,
maybe Shoshana first, and then Sue.
I'll go because, as you know, I have to sign off in a moment. But if you don't mind, Sue. Look, I don't necessarily accept your view of the constraints here, Bhaskar. When we're talking about creating the regulatory and legislative paradigms that it will take to rein in this extractive capitalism, which, by the way, the telecom companies themselves are well imbricated in this logic, because in many respects they're doing some of the same things. So that's not the same kind of expenditure as when we talk about infrastructure. What I'm suggesting is a lot of the infrastructure that is there, we have to redefine it as critical infrastructure. And when we do that, we open up the opportunities for different kinds of not only private sector competitors, but public competitors. We open up the space so that to unwind these economics, just one little sentence here. One of the big costs that's built into this now is that these extractive operations of surveillance capitalism have complicated AI manufacturing facilities, which are extremely costly, and complicated storage, server, and chip innovation capabilities, which are extremely costly. All of these because when they produce predictions of human behavior, they sell them at terrific margins, and this is what has made their business so lucrative. But when we're taking those surveillance dividends out of the equation, we're looking at a very different landscape. We're looking at a landscape where now universities can compete, and municipalities can compete, and federal governments can compete, and state governments can compete, because we're taking out the costs that produce the surveillance dividend, that produce the profits. So we're completely changing the economics of these operations. So my view, Bhaskar, here is that nothing is inevitable. If we're going to change competition, if we're going to change the cost dimensions of this work, if we're going to start understanding it as critical infrastructure and claim it for public law under democratic governance, and tethered always to public service and to fundamental rights, that means a fundamentally different cost structure than what we have now. And to me, this is essential to not only, opening up the economics so that everybody has a chance to participate, both on the consumption side and on the production side, but also fundamentally changing both the cost of the infrastructure and the meaning of the infrastructure, how we use it and what we use it for. So it's finally serving society and serving people, rather than extracting from society and extracting from people.
Great, thank you, Shoshana. And I think the key words that I would take away from your observations is making some fundamental structural changes which open up the economics and reduce the rent-seeking potential which exists today. Sue, your comments, and Shoshana, thank you so much for joining in. We know that the time change made it difficult for you. I know the same is for Sue. So we really appreciate both of you being so flexible. But I'll turn to Sue, and I'd love to get your reactions, knowing that you have to run very soon as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was actually pretty interesting about this Biden plan, which Bhaskar is not convinced will go anywhere, but is this notion that community-based organizations should now be prioritized when we're talking about broadband. This, as we know, has been problematic. There was so much lobbying done in Washington by the telecom companies to make it impossible for municipalities and nonprofits and community organizations to provide this kind of service. And I think just the recognition to begin with in this plan of Biden's that is true, and that putting some community control into this, going back to that rural electrification model, it won't do what Shoshana wants it to do. It won't have a kind of radical reordering, but it does have the capacity to bring communities, whether they're rural communities or urban communities that have been left behind. It has the capacity to bring those communities into this world that, of internet, fast broadband. And I think that, in a way, even more than the money, is a kind of terrific move on the part of the Biden administration, because it will potentially put those telecom companies on notice, that there could be competition for people's money and for communities' interest in their products. So I think it does have a kind of interesting potential economic impact were it to happen. And that could happen even if the $100 billion doesn't happen. Those laws can change. I think last time I looked, it was like 22 states have been lobbied to death so that they couldn't do this. And, if you stop that, and as we know, if you don't have shareholders that you have to, satisfy, and it becomes a public good, you can produce things at much cheaper costs, or potentially cheaper costs, and that's a good thing too. So for me, it wasn't so much as the $100 billion, because I don't even know what that means. Like, I don't think anyone really does. Daryl's colleague, Tom Wheeler, at some point said it was like $40 billion. And then there was an organization, the Fiber Broadband, and, said it would be like, I can't remember, it was like $70 billion. It's just like the numbers just fly all over the place. But if you can change this notion of who can provide service, and you can make it a public good, I think then we're talking, of making something very different than what we have right now.
Yeah, so Sue, if I could sort of tie your observations with Shoshana's, you're also talking about opening up the economics. And part of opening up the economics is introducing competition, and particularly competition, from the public sector, from the municipal sector. And as you mentioned, 22 states where that have been lobbied to prevent a municipal broadband, and there are many states where there were lawsuits against the introduction of municipal broadband. So the challenge for the Biden administration sitting in Washington, D.C., of course, is that they have very little leverage when there are lawsuits that are happening in North Carolina and various parts of the country, while the Biden administration administration also needs to protect its political capital for a variety of other issues that they're trying to address, whether it is COVID response, vaccine rollout, mask mandates, letting people eat outside or inside in restaurants. It's economic recovery. It's a big basket of issues. Daryl, any comment on the number that Sue was just talking about? Is there an analysis that Tom Wheeler and others have been doing, or your colleagues at Brookings, in terms of putting a little bit of a finer point on those billions of dollars of numbers that keep floating about?
Well, when Tom Wheeler chaired the Federal Communications Commission several years ago, they did an analysis, and the numbers kind of ranged from 40 to 70 billion. But that was 4 to 5 years ago now, so I'm sure the numbers are much higher right now. It's hard to know exactly what it would take to get to 100%. I think your analysis certainly indicates that the price tag is much higher for rural areas than urban areas just because of population density. I mean, the big challenge with rural broadband is low population density. I mean, I actually grew up in rural Ohio, just a little bit north of Cincinnati, and I remember, visiting my hometown, and like 10 miles north of there, I could get a signal. 10 miles south of there, I could get a signal, but I couldn't get a signal right there. And so that has certainly been a big problem for a number of years. But I do think Biden's heart is in the right place, in the sense that he understands, and COVID certainly has demonstrated this, that we need digital connections. It is critical infrastructure. Like, you cannot really participate in the economy, in schooling, or even in parts of healthcare without a good and reliable broadband. So the fact that they're willing to devote at least 100 billion for high-speed broadband, I think, is a good sign. I like their provision on trying to encourage more competition in the marketplace by allowing local communities to develop their own broadband infrastructure and not just be dependent on the private providers. So that certainly will be a big help. I think Biden already is demonstrating he is appointing people who have a tougher stance on the tech sector in general to some of the key commissions, the Federal Trade Commission. We haven't seen the Department of Justice or the Federal Communications Commission appointments, but we're anticipating he's going to have some tough-minded individuals there as well. And so we're expecting federal agency enforcement to get tougher in general. Brookings President John Allen and I wrote a book entitled Turning Point, and we argued America is at a turning point right now in terms of our public policy. For most of the last 30 years, America has had a libertarian stance on the tech sector with virtually no regulation. The popular mantra was permissionless innovation, that basically the private companies could do whatever they want, develop the products they wanted, deploy them when they wanted, sell them to whomever they wanted. We believe that era has come to an end. We are starting to move into a new era where there's going to be more public engagement, public oversight, and public regulation. It's just a question of what form that is going to take. So we're already seeing antitrust actions by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission against Google and Facebook. That's probably going to spread to some other companies as well. The congressional hearings that took place this year, you're seeing both Republicans and Democrats come together in support of the idea of market competition, that we need more competition. We can't let the large players kind of squeeze out the small providers, because we know the history of technology innovation is some of the best ideas have started in people's garages and basements, and we need to maintain that innovation ecosystem. So I think Biden understands the problems. He's moving towards policies and investments and appointments that I think are going to make a difference. And I think the future of the tech sector is going to be subject to much more regulation than what we've seen over the last 30 years.
Interesting points, Daryl, and we will have a chance to return to them. I know that I think we have just lost Sue, so I just wanted to thank Sue for joining us and kind of lending her insights, into this complicated set of issues. And Daryl, your comment about the turning point is so well taken, and it's so appropriate. We're all feeling that turning point in terms of our relationship with technology. The question, of course, is there a traffic cop who is helping us figure out where in this rotary we need to turn. Because there are congressional hearings here, congressional hearings there, Section 230, misinformation, antitrust, digital divide, and there are 15 other things going on in terms of technology. And in the meantime, President Biden has been mum in terms of technology. He's barely said anything himself. And so one almost wishes for a technology czar, an internet czar. In fact, that's a point that we want to make, from our team here, is that there is a need for someone like a John Kerry, who was the climate czar, who's been appointed. At least one can turn to somebody with gravitas, somebody who can knock heads together, connect the dots, and help us sort of think about a holistic way of approaching these issues, particularly as we are coming out of 12 months of entirely living on technology. Even our frontline workers, who were our heroes, working on the front lines of healthcare or food preparation or food delivery, they had children at home. And many of those frontline workers' children couldn't actually attend school because they live in the worst internet connected areas. Or the least, or for them, internet connectivity is the least affordable. So we have so many complex issues relating to our connection with technology, and we're living it on a day-to-day basis as people are signing up for a vaccine. And those who need it the most are the furthest behind in terms of where they stand relative to the digital divide. And unfortunately, information about the vaccine is delivered digitally. You find out whether you're eligible, or you can sign up only if you are digitally enabled. So there are all these contradictions that we are trying to grapple with. And so we need the traffic cop somewhere to help us figure out that turning point. But I'd love to return to this hopefully with your help, we can think about some structured ways in which we can organize some of these thoughts and perhaps bring it to the relevant audiences, because I know that they're all exploring solutions to a common problem that we are all experiencing. So with your permission, with the permission of everybody here who has kindly joined us, I will share a little bit more in terms of some of the analyses and data that we've been uncovering, and use that as framing for the next phase of our conversation. So with that, let me see if the technology will allow me to get back to my pages. And here we go. So I left you with Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who is going to be a significant player, or his colleagues are going to be significant players in terms of whether we get any portion of that 100 billion or 240 billion, whichever number one wants to pick, or Tom Wheeler's $40 billion, right? So to take you to the next phase of our conversation, before I go any further, I just want to provide a little bit of background and context on the work that we've been doing as part of imagining a digital economy for all. We are studying 90 countries around the world. It's not just the United States. Over the course of the last 12 months, we also found out that the United States is not one country. It's in fact 50 countries at a state-by-state level, plus the District of Columbia. Never forget you, Darryl. So there are 51 different municipalities, as it were. And of course, even within a state, the cities and the governors are fighting with each other. They don't agree. Exhibit A is Texas, Exhibit B is Georgia, and we could keep going. So there are multiple different countries even within the United States. So this is a pretty Herculean effort, which, thanks to our colleagues that we've been working with across a number of different organizations, it's been possible to do this work and put a certain amount of evidence behind a number of the propositions that are now on the table. I have a long list of colleagues to thank, and if I were to run down their names, I would exhaust the time that we have on our webinar. But I've got their names on one page. If I miss somebody here, I deeply apologize for having missed you. But we are grateful to everyone on this page who has helped us in the process of getting to some of the insights that I wanted to share. And in case you want to reach us and you have questions, you want to challenge any points that we make, you have some new data to bring to bear, you want to get access to some of our data and analysis, here are some contact points that I would ask you to note. We'll also put it in the chat so that we want this to be an ongoing conversation. There's no way that we at the Fletcher School can cover a surface area as wide as this. So this is truly, we hope, a collaborative effort. So what we did, just in terms of trying to understand the United States, was we wanted to get a sense of the depth of the digital divide. And we recognize that the digital divide in this country is not uniform. It's not the same if you are in Maine and Vermont as if you were in California, or if you are where I'm sitting in Massachusetts. It varies significantly on a state-by-state basis. And so we divided the notion of a divide along four major axes. One is the axis of infrastructure, which is something that we automatically turn to. But then there are also the axis of institutions and laws and regulations. As Sue was talking about, the fact that there is a need to bring in more municipal competitors, public sector competitors who can provide internet access. Well, that problem can be solved or potentially addressed through an institutional change that requires changes in policy, changes in laws and regulations. And these vary on a state-by-state basis. Others have observed to us that everybody has access to the internet, but then not everybody has access to the internet. There's a problem of affordability and inclusion. And sadly, these inclusion divisions run not only along socioeconomic lines, but they also run along racial lines. And what we've seen is stark differences between the Black community, the Hispanic community, in terms of their access to the internet and their usage of the internet, which then translates into their economic well-being, their health, and a variety of other factors, the education of their children, whether they are going to get a federal stimulus check or not. These are all tied into their ability to operate a computer or a smartphone. And it turns out that operational effectiveness is different depending on where you live, how much money you make, what your education level is, and what the color of your skin is, sadly. And of course, this is not just a supply side issue, as I mentioned before. There's a demand and a consumer proficiency issue as well that plays an enormous role. And let me sort of step back and give you one more breaking news. Breaking news is, as I mentioned, we studied 90 countries around the world. We tracked 90 countries in terms of their digital evolution, how they're moving from a physical past to a digital future. And out of the 90 countries, the United States ranks number 2. It's the second most digitally evolved country in the world after Singapore. Just imagine that. We are living in the second most digitally evolved country in the world. And yet you will see lots of differences in terms of how that technology is serving us. And those differences vary depending on whether you live in states that are low on all those factors: institutions, inclusion, infrastructure, digital proficiency. An example of such a state that I will spend a little bit of time on is Alabama, or Group 3, which are states that are actually firing on all cylinders in general. An example of such a state is California. And then Group 2, which is kind of in between. They are strong in some dimensions and not so strong in other dimensions. And an example that I will touch on is Maine, from that, that final archetype. So here's the picture of California that I showed you before. California, remember, is Group 3, which is they're firing on all cylinders in general. However, even in California, the home of, I hate to say this, I'm living in Boston. Boston used to be the home of high tech, big tech, tech in general. We ceded the ground to California. At least the high point to California. We still are a home of a lot of great things happening in terms of technology. However, even in California, there are huge divides. You can see all those red zones, which means there are people who are not getting access to the internet at broadband speeds. What that means is if their child has to download homework, you have to drive that child to the back of a McDonald's so that they can piggyback off of somebody's Wi-Fi. If you are looking to get a job interview and you want to do a Zoom video interview because you've just been laid off through the pandemic, you may not be able to do it from your home in the county of Modoc in California. I'm getting familiar with all these different counties of the United States. The spike in the middle is the city of San Francisco, which sadly is not the greenest of green. And our data shows that about 15 million people in urban California, in urban counties in California, are not using the internet at Zoom level speeds, which is a pretty sad indictment. And California in general does pretty well in terms of its ability to sort of hit all the major metrics of internet speeds and terrestrial broadband coverage and smartphone usage on average relative to the median of the country. The blue line, it's very hard to see these graphs, but there's a blue line running through these radials, which shows the average or the median across the country. So it is a way to kind of set some kind of a benchmark in terms of where your state is. So you can see that California does pretty well on several dimensions, and some dimensions it's it's sort of just at the median. And so here we are. It is beating the median in terms of inclusion, infrastructure in general, in terms of institutions. And as far as usage or digital proficiency is concerned, it's strong in some dimensions, but not so strong in terms of for instance, political tolerance, a measure that we use to calibrate how sophisticated or proficient a user you are of the internet. There's more we can go into on that particular front. A few other views of California that are kind of interesting, and I'll just flash this in front of you, and I'll let each one of you sort of derive your own conclusions or pattern recognition here. So here is broadband usage across the state of California. Dark means good, light means not so good, right? Here is smartphone only usage, which means dark is smartphone only. Now that's not good, because if you are primarily accessing the internet on a smartphone, that means you're connected to the internet, but you don't really have a computer to go to. So if your child has to do homework, your child will have to do their homework on a smartphone, which isn't a good place to be. So dark here is actually not a good thing. And we just have so many ways to cut this data. So we just decided to cut it along racial lines. That's the density of the Hispanic population in California, and that's the density of the Black population in California. If you see any patterns, if you see any interesting correlations, if you see any connections, we're not drawing causation here, but the overlap of some of these patterns is interesting and gives us a moment to reflect and pause. So I'll just take 30 seconds and let you absorb this, because I've just poured a lot in front of you. And this, by the way, is the great state of California. Okay. We can do the same for the other states. That's Maine. Maine, unlike California, is below the median on most counts. Bit of a mixed picture in terms of its digital proficiency. And in terms of broadband usage, smartphone only usage, proportion of minority populations, that's what Maine looks like. There are some data gaps here. We don't have data on large tracts of Maine in terms of where people are only using a smartphone. So that's why you'll see a certain portion of Maine grayed out. But again, a few seconds to just reflect on these patterns, and we can come back to this in our discussions. Alabama. Now here's sort of an interesting picture of Alabama, which you'll see that the plateaus, the high points of Alabama, an interesting point in Alabama is Mobile, Alabama, which is an urban cluster. But you'll see that it is sort of orange, which is worrisome. It's worrisome. There's orange means people are not using the internet at Zoom level speeds, which so it's not just a rural problem alone. And that's something to be mindful of. And we see these patterns across a number of states, particularly in the South and Southwest. And there's Alabama, again, significantly below the median across all fronts. That's why it was in the group 1 archetype. And here is the broadband usage, smartphone only usage, Hispanic population, and Black populations. Taking a bird's eye view of the United States, We can do this for every state, as I mentioned. This is what the infrastructure differences across the country look like. Green is good, red or orange is not so good. Yellow is in between. That's what the institutional map looks like. This relates to going back to Sue Halpern's point. Do we have laws and regulations that allow for municipal broadband to come in and provide for competition? Is there a broadband strategy? Does the state government, does the state governor's office, do they have a policy or a plan to provide internet access? If they do, they get a green score. If they don't, you start tending towards yellow or orange. Inclusion. You can see the differences in terms of where the states are in terms of how affordable and inclusive access to the internet is. And finally, proficiency. Now you'll see that there are some recurring patterns. I won't spell it out for you, but I'm sure there are thoughtful people across this call, and each one of you can draw upon your patterns. By the way, as I know, there's an enormous amount of information that's being transmitted here. This is all going to be on our website in a few hours. We'll put it up for your perusal, and we welcome your comments. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a number of reflections. So even as President Biden is announcing his infrastructure plan, that $100 billion number, of course, it originated with the work that Daryl, your colleague, Tom Wheeler, and his colleagues had done. And since then, it has grown. It has developed into an $80 billion proposal for broadband connectivity, which was then added to, and it became a nice round number of 100 billion. But we can see that there are a number of different places where there are gaps in terms of access and affordability. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is the primary place where we turn to, where the government turns to get data on how deeply divided the country is. The FCC itself doesn't have the right data. In fact, the current acting chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel herself, when she was a commissioner in the previous administration, challenged her own commission's data and said, we have the data wrong. And so the first step here is to get that data right. And it is shocking that we in the United States, we're supposed to be a data-intensive, data-rich country. We don't have data on the state of our data industry. So we need to fix that. As Sue mentioned, the Lifeline program, that Lifeline program is a mess. The Lifeline program was torched by the previous administration. We need to get that back. Net neutrality is a mess. Internet service providers have few incentives to serve rural communities. Broadband access in the United States is one of the most expensive anywhere in the world. And this is a problem not just with the rural households, urban households lack internet access as well. There are all kinds of barriers that are preventing competition. So there are many, many issues beyond money that need to be addressed. There is a quality gap. Broadband is not the same thing if you are in the United States and if you're in Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, broadband or a high quality internet means 375 megabits per second. I know that's sort of techie, jargony, but just look at the number. 375 is defined as acceptable or median internet speeds in Luxembourg. In America, it's 55 megabits per second. In my home, I get less than 10. So I'm living in Brookline, Massachusetts, for crying out loud. So this is a crying shame for the United States to be so far behind, and we are the country that invented the internet. The internet, mostly held up through the pandemic, surprising to many people, but it did. However, most of our busiest metropolitan areas did get stressed, and there were network slowdowns, which did cause productivity slowdowns in many parts of the country. And as we know, as organizations start coming back, we're going to see a significant portion of work continuing to stay remote. It may be 2 days a week, maybe 3 days a week on average. We don't know how things are going to pan out. So we do need that internet infrastructure in certainly the metropolitan areas and in the rural infrastructure to be improved upon if we are going to build back better an American economy that is globally competitive. And we are way behind in terms of our European counterparts in terms of broadband speed. So our quality itself is behind. We're behind in terms of serving our children. We are behind in terms of serving our children. They've had a rotten time, we all know that, during the pandemic, and they continue to do so as so many of them are at home. It turns out that if you're Black and brown, if you're poor, your experience is far, far worse than if you live in a wealthier part of the country. And that should just be unacceptable. So we need to be addressing these issues. We need to be addressing issues in terms of healthcare disparity. We are living through a public health crisis. And even today, as vaccines are being rolled out, it depends critically on whether you have good internet connection or not, whether you know how to use the internet. And that is going to drive whether you get access to a vaccine. I'll give you one data point that I found striking. And here is Shelby County, which is just outside Nashville, Tennessee. The poorest zip code in Shelby County is 96% Black, and 70% of households do not have internet access. 70% of the poorest zip code in Shelby County does not have internet access. When the county first launched its vaccine rollout, all the appointments were available only online. Only online. How can this happen? It can happen because our public health authorities are not talking to the digital authorities. We need to be able to break down those silos. As I mentioned before, this digital divide is a divide, not just a rural and urban issue. It's not just a socioeconomic issue. It's a Black, Hispanic, white, Asian issue. We saw over the course of summer 2020, cries for racial justice explode on the streets across America. Right now, there is a landmark trial that is ongoing, a trial, the murder of George Floyd, which sparked those protests. Companies, governments, agencies, individuals swore up and down. They said, they attached a hashtag to whatever your favorite term of art was, for racial justice, and they swore up and down saying, never again, we're gonna turn the clock back on racial injustice. Guess what? Racial injustice lives right now on the digital infrastructure. The digital infrastructure is sharply divided depending on which side of the racial divide you're on, and we need to fix that. In terms of digital proficiency, there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of consumer education. So this is not just Mark Zuckerberg, preventing misinformation from coming down the Facebook pages, or others, being held accountable for what is on their social media platforms. It's also up to us as users. And how do we educate our users? How do we build better digital hygiene? How do we build digital trust? These are all issues that should be part of a plan to close the digital divide. So we believe that there are a number of recommendations. I can run down a few, but I'm also mindful of the fact that I have poured an enormous amount of information at you and all of you. But here is an opportunity for me to turn back to my friend Darrell West, because Darrell is at what I would imagine the preeminent platform for influencing policy. And I'm curious about any observations or reflections, Darrell, that you might have of this very broad brush sweep that I just provided, and any advice that you would give us and others on this call as to how some of these messages can be converted into policy recommendations, and how we might work together to bring this to decision makers who can actually make a difference. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Darrell for any top-level observations and advice on how we can make a difference.
Well, congratulations on the study. It's very comprehensive. It's great to see the state-by-state breakdowns, and people can kind of look to see what their own situation is and how it compares elsewhere within their state as well as across all of the states. So I certainly appreciate all the work that went into this. I think this is a study that policymakers will love, and we're certainly happy to help you spread the word through Washington, D.C. As you know, we have a Tech Tank policy blog, which is very widely read within D.C. policy circles. So we'd love to get a blog post from you that kind of summarizes the key elements and then links to the larger report that you put out. I think that would be one way to go. From the standpoint of public policy, I think there are lots of ideas that come out of your study. Certainly, the Biden investment in infrastructure is absolutely crucial. I mean, we can't solve the problem just with money, but there are some resources that are going to be required to close the divide. You talked about the crucial role of the Federal Communications Commission, and you're exactly right. A lot of people don't appreciate how important that commission is for digital access questions in general. The Lifeline program was designed to help low-income people move from the phone era to the internet access world. But as you pointed out, and my colleague Tom Wheeler has commented on, the number actually has fallen. The number of people helped by that program from what was 12.7 million people in 2016 down to 7.3 million in 2020. And you should keep in mind, there actually are 38 million Americans who qualify for Lifeline assistance, but only 7 million, which is less than 20%, actually are using it. So clearly that is a big problem, and we hope the new administration can help address that. The other FCC program that has been designed to provide help here is the E-rate program, which is designed to help schools and libraries connect and be fully connected at a high speed to the internet. And certainly with COVID, as we've moved into online education, that becomes even more important. But the E-rate program actually has a $2 billion surplus, so they're not even using the money that has been appropriated over the last few years. And certainly anything that helps the anchor institutions in any community be connected, that's going to percolate throughout the entire community. So schools, libraries, and hospitals certainly are key targets. The last thing I'll comment on is one of your big principles in your analysis was digital proficiency. And I've always thought that was an underestimated part of this whole access equation. I mean, as Sue and Shoshana had pointed out, there certainly are lots of barriers to digital access in terms of lacking the infrastructure for the connection, the high cost of the internet access, and other things like that. But we also believe that digital literacy programs need to be part of this equation as well. Like certainly with senior citizens, you know, they did not grow up with the technology. They are not the digital natives that probably many of the young people on this call are. And so, you know, they don't necessarily know how to set up the connection, how to take advantage of the internet, how to kind of explore the different options. And in earlier eras, you know, we had government agencies reach out to help people learn how to use new techniques. So I think in the current era, we can't just assume everybody knows the internet or everybody knows how to set up their digital connections. We need digital literacy programs that will really train people, older people, poor people, other people who are underutilizing the resources. So I think all those things would be a big help in terms of closing the digital divide.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Daryl, and we look forward to kind of partnering with you on several of these ideas, both to sharpen the ideas and get additional feedback from you and your colleagues, and then kind of spreading some of these ideas into the policy circles, both in DC and in other parts of the country. And we are grateful for that partnership. Let me bring in my colleague Christina Filipovich, who is going to help us moderate some of the questions, because there are lots of questions that are popping up in the chat. And perhaps, Christina, you can select a few. I know that we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but to the extent that we can hit on some of the key points here, and certainly while we have Daryl here to get his perspective. And I also want to recognize Miguel Gamino. Thank you, Miguel, for joining us. And we have you ready for our to sort of take us out on conclusion, but do feel free to jump in with your observations and comments, because you've been sitting very patiently up to this point. So feel free to unmute and jump right in. And if there's any immediate observation that you have, Miguel, do offer it before I turn it over to Christina.
Well, the one thing I'll say is, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to the energetic, enthusiastic conversation. I've been on this broadband mission for a decade, or actually a couple decades. So to see it come to this kind of energetic conversation is a long time coming. And many of the points made about even the FCC and Lifeline, net neutrality, E-rate, I have lots of opinions on those things, spanning over administrations, to be fair and to be clear. But I think like maybe the one point before you go to Christina, and then I'll have various comments and kind of the wrap up. The one point I think is to emphasize that this is something that we have to do together. It requires all kind of sectors of the economy and the policymaking, and frankly, even maybe most importantly, the operationalizing of these policies and these ideas to come together to see this to some meaningful outcome. This is going to absolutely be a cross-sector team effort if we are to accomplish even a portion of this ambition together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Miguel, and we'll come back to you shortly for the wrap up. But if there are any of the questions that you would like to comment on, do jump in. And my colleagues who work with me know that I am also notorious for commenting on people's Zoom background. So I love the Magritte behind you, big fan. So thank you for bringing Magritte and a bit of surrealism into our discussion. Christina.
Sure. First question is comparing to other countries. So the question is, what are the formal structures in other countries like Singapore, South Korea, countries in Europe that enable better and more equitable digital access? Structures meaning private or public entities as well as regulatory, and how are these costs managed? So I think that could go to Bhaskar or Daryl.
Daryl, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I can make a couple of quick observations, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you or Miguel have as well. South Korea and Singapore had particular advantages in terms of providing digital access because the population density there is very high. Like in South Korea, people basically live in about 7 different cities. And so it was relatively easy and inexpensive for South Korea to wire the country. Same is true in terms of Singapore. And then, once you have the basic infrastructure in, then you can start to provide services. So we used to do e-government studies where we rated governments around the world on using the internet to deliver government services. Singapore always did really well. South Korea did very well. And they defined that as a national priority. They invested, they got people wired, and they have very high-speed broadband. As you pointed out earlier, they're 2 to 3 times the speeds that we have here in the United States. And when you have fast platforms, that allows you to do novel things in terms of service provision and other interactions with the government. So I think those are some of the key things that have allowed some countries to kind of move ahead and do better than the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Miguel.
I think it would also be remiss to not kind of illuminate the fact that those political structures, funding structures are entirely different, and that's a factor for sure. And in terms of the decision making and prioritization and how investments are even executed, I think what can be learned from some of those countries are the outcomes. Right? We don't have to theorize what happens when you have a community that's hyper connected. There are places that have accomplished that better than we have. And you can look to them for what those outcomes are in real time. You don't have to hypothesize.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised that point, Miguel, which is the political structures play an important role. And Griffin, if you could enter in the chat the link to the Digital Intelligence Index, which and also the interactive tool, it'll actually you can break down for anybody how the infrastructure is different depending on whether you're in South Korea or Singapore or Malaysia or any other part of the world. A big difference in all these countries, several of the countries that Daryl, you mentioned, and others, Miguel, that you were alluding to, are countries that are, to some extent, the geography helps. They're smaller. Second, and the population density is kind of concentrated in urban areas. Another factor is the political system and the extent to which the government plays an active role in the underlying ecosystem and providing the infrastructure and also providing the right incentives for the private sector. So what we have found is that countries like Singapore, like the UAE, South Korea are extremely well connected. But then there are countries like The United Kingdom, interestingly enough, that is also well connected. New Zealand, which is on the other side of the planet, and in many ways, they are shortening the distance that they have with the rest of the planet by being digitally close, even though they're geographically far away, by investing and over-investing in their domestic and international internet connectivity. So the government's vision and activism in terms of setting a digital vision, a digital goal, is enormously important. And here in the United States, we are lacking that. And hopefully that is part of the Build Back Better plan. So it goes beyond putting dollars into the pot. There needs to be a plan. Other questions, Christina?
Sure. We have quite a few questions about misinformation, disinformation, the future of democracy, not only in the US, but we have an attendee from Georgia, the country, who's asking about this. And the question is, what is academia or sort of the think tank Brookings' role in holding the surveillance capitalists accountable for their abuses of our data? And then the second question is there enough collaboration between academia, policymakers, and the private sector to solve the digital divide? So that might be a good question for Miguel, the second part.
Okay, so I'll punt the first part to Daryl and the second one to Miguel.
Christina is exactly right. I mean, misinformation is a huge problem in the social media world. There are algorithms that can help the companies spot clear misinformation and take things down, but the companies just need to get much more aggressive on that front. I mean, we're seeing a huge problem now in terms of people not wanting to get the COVID vaccination. And if we have 20 to 30% of our population not getting vaccinated, it almost guarantees there are going to be surges next fall and next winter. So there are public health consequences that come out of the misinformation. The other part is the data sharing aspect, and that certainly is a huge problem right now. I mean, there are third-party aggregators that take a little bit of information from one organization, add it to information from organization B, C, D, and E, and then suddenly you have hundreds of data on a particular individual. And so, these brokers are kind of using information in ways that the original consumer isn't even aware of. Like, you might be aware of the 10 data points you give one organization, but not aware that how information you provide to each organization gets aggregated. So we do hope that the new privacy legislation that's being debated in Congress will help address some of these issues, and the Federal Trade Commission also is paying attention there as well.
Great, thanks, Daryl. Over to you, Miguel, about any thoughts on the importance of partnerships across the different sectors?
Yeah, I mean, the question, is there enough collaboration across sectors? It depends. Probably not in the aggregate. I think certainly what we're seeing is, again, kind of what I said in my previous comments about coming together. I think there are different resources and capabilities and objectives, frankly, from the various sectors that, when brought together, are kind of better suited to address the holistic issue. And I can say that from having served on both sides of the equation, right? For those that don't know my background, I was in charge of broadband strategy for San Francisco, New York, and El Paso, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. So many of the maps you were showing brought back vivid memories of the effort, and the effort that still needs to be carried forward. But it was always seen, at least in my view, to only be able to be accomplished by way of partnerships. And so, no, there's not enough, but I'm hopeful that things, frankly, conversations like this and partnerships like the ones we have are going to help continue to stimulate that and provide evidence for how important it is to accomplishing that mission.
Great, wonderful. So with that, it's a perfect segue, Miguel. I'll turn the floor over to you, because we are in that wrap up and conclusion phase. So over to you, Miguel. Take us out.
Sure. Thank you. And again, thanks for having me here to be part of such an important discussion, one that's near and dear to my heart. I've already said it, but it's worth repeating. This is really about coming together to accomplish that greater vision. I spent nearly a decade on carrying on this discussion from within city government and even on committees at the FCC. Many conversations about all the programs that were mentioned here across administrations. And to be fair, it never was perfect. It was better and then worse. But again, I think we can now carry forward and focus on the path forward collectively. Today's discussion for me highlighted that also this past year has dramatically accelerated that digital shift of our economies and our societies, and escalating or bringing a spotlight to the essential role that connectivity and digital service play in economic inclusion, economic recovery, and even social cohesion, and the future of democracy, I think, was alluded. And so this pandemic really did expose and exacerbate, in many cases, those existing gaps and inequalities. Some of us, many of us, were beating this drum before COVID, and then COVID turned up the volume for us and got a lot more people paying attention and listening and talking and engaging. And I think that is, if nothing else, a silver lining and a source of optimism as we build back better and come out of this. Bhaskar, in your words, you poured on to the discussion that even in developed countries and US states and cities, that this divide exists. And I would say that is almost more dangerous because it's to some extent hiding in plain sight. When I was in San Francisco, we measured unconnected or underconnected populations, and it was roughly 10% of the population. I got to New York City and began the same sort of measure and came to essentially the same metric. So this isn't, I don't have like a research study to point to. This was in the job, actively measuring the addressable problem. That's what I can tell you from my personal experience. And that was more surprising to many people in the policymaking and decision-making realm than had I said rural America is unconnected. That is a big problem and with a different set of issues, but less surprising to most people. When I told people that people in downtown San Francisco or downtown New York were not properly connected, that caught them by surprise. And so these conversations are absolutely important. And a big part of it was simply that it was too expensive, that residents couldn't afford to prioritize that for their household. And so that needs to be part of it. This is not just, I saw some of the questions or comments about fiber to the premise. Bringing it to the curb doesn't connect it to people. It's part of it. The infrastructure is certainly part of it, but we have to think about it holistically to include affordability and also absolutely literacy. And so these digital deserts, again, I'm kind of repeating or summarizing, I guess, some of the points already made. They hamper healthcare, the healthcare gap, as you described it, the pretty well documented from my good friend, Commissioner or Chairwoman Rosenworcel, the homework gap. It's no longer just the homework gap, it's the education gap, full stop, right? In the pre-COVID world, we talked about it as a homework gap because the notion was when you left the classroom, there was a divide. We've exacerbated that by forcing the classroom into your living room, right? And I can tell you a quick story. In San Francisco, when we launched public Wi-Fi, I was at a library. We were celebrating this accomplishment. And afterward, a mother came up to me and shared with me she was thanking me, trying to hug me, that we left Wi-Fi on after the library closed. And it took me a minute to even understand what she meant. And she told me that her son would sometimes stay on the library steps after the library closed to finish his homework. And I still to this day, 10 years later, have goosebumps when I tell that story. If that doesn't land the issue for you, then I don't know what does. Because in the center of the innovation capital of the world, by some claims, San Francisco, I was immediately both proud and embarrassed. Proud that we had at least made some progress during my leadership, but also embarrassed that that was the best we could do, where the internet was invented, to your point. And that just, if it wasn't already an ambition, a personal ambition for me before, at that moment. And so that's what makes it real for me, that this is real life impacts to real people. And so I think, you know, the role, we all have a role to play in this effort. The government clearly has an important role, a seat at the table, resources to commit, but they can't do it alone. Companies need to engage with governments as partners and co-problem solvers and drive this impact together, and build a foundation of trust to accelerate this progress, and recognize and leverage the differences of strengths, resources, experiences that we each bring to the table. Those aren't counterproductive. Those are absolutely productive if we recognize them, respect them, and mobilize them. And so the private sector needs to also infuse this sense of inclusion into how we build technology and identify these challenges and solve these problems going forward. And a couple quick examples of that. Alongside Ford Foundation, we, MasterCard, invested in New York City's Internet for All plan. And we put some money in that unlocked 157 million of their own capital funding to invest in broadband deployment. And that, we believe, is going to help create this inclusive community, inclusive economy that's not only going to benefit the community itself around it. I think that there's kind of three quick areas to focus on that align very much, Bhaskar, with your points on infrastructure, institutions, inclusivity, and digital proficiency. On infrastructure, elimination of broadband gap requires low-cost technology at scale. Innovation is the key, but cost associated with that is critically important. This investment in core digital infrastructure will provide the access and reduce the cost of even financial services to unbanked and underserved, and even attract more service providers to expand that consumer choice that was also discussed earlier. But the infrastructure alone is not enough. Again, bringing fiber to the curb doesn't actually accomplish the true ambition, at least from my view. I said it for years and years. And so we have to focus on access and affordability also. Make services dependable, affordable, and available is critical to adoption and the benefits that will be derived from digital access to all people. The team, I heard recommendations around funding for school broadband, and I think the homework gap, or I'm gonna ask Rosenworcel to potentially consider amending her phrase to the education gap full stop, is an incredible place to start. I can't think of a place that will produce more fruit than an investment in digital infrastructure there. And it's also very important to note that to rectify this digital poverty gap, we have to employ education. Again, the digital literacy element that you shared is not only important to helping people understand the value of it, but also to trust it, right? To understand the privacy concerns, to understand even these data usage and privacy agreements being in simple language that they can understand what is really at risk. And that's the only way we get to what I believe is critically important, this sense of consent, right? People have to, if they consent, they're in control. And if they're in control, then they are more likely to engage. And I think that only happens if we simplify the terms and the engagement and the discussion and the language and the vocabulary that we use to describe what people are exposed to. And just if we do this and people understand, the head of household that's making the decisions might better understand the value, the critical nature of this to the children they have in their home, right? We also have to recognize that the people potentially most impacted might not be the people making the decision for the household. So we have to educate the parents on how important this is to their children. So even if they don't have a direct value kind of need of the broadband access, they have to understand how critically important it is to the future for their family. And I think that is part and parcel to education or digital literacy. So, you know, also I couldn't have this discussion without acknowledging the remote workforce, right? The economic development strategies and realities of these cities as people are now moving around somewhat permanently, somewhat temporarily, but always being impactful of or considerate of digital infrastructure. And if we get those things right, that can be a net growth, a net benefit to many cities around the country in the form of job creation, increased local incomes, activating the local economy. And so, you know, I think to kind of sum up, we can't have this internet of everything without inclusion of everyone. We have to think about who this is really intended to serve. So we at MasterCard and the Center for Inclusive Growth, we're proud to be partnering with IDEA 2030 and the Fletcher School to investigate how we can build this more inclusive digital economy and make these investments wisely and most effectively. So I have to, again, thank you for the incredibly rich and insightful discussion. You've, I think, really helped land some concrete ideas and recommendations. The one thing I would say is let's not stop at policymaking. Let's make sure this moves into action. There are operators that need to be included in this conversation. It's not enough to just put the good idea on paper and make it law. We have to make sure it actually gets implemented so people see its benefit and its outcome. And I would encourage all participants to think about that and share these insights widely and continue these discussions about these important issues so we can start to realize this change, you know, today, not decades from now when it might be too late. And so I think if we come together, we work together, then my catchphrase, my hashtag, if you will, is we can make tech work for people the way that it should. So thank you so much for the opportunity to again, listen and learn, but also share my thoughts and opinions and lots of personal skin in this game. And so anytime I have the opportunity to engage this way, I'm incredibly grateful.
Miguel, thank you so much for putting it so clearly and for articulating, you know, both the challenges that we need to wrap our arms around, but also some very specific actions that we can take. But when I say we, it cuts across policy, business, the technology innovators and academics and everybody else, you know, who has a vested interest in technology. Your anecdote about the library in San Francisco, I know it touched you deeply because it was the center of the work that you were doing. It's something that is going to stay with me for a long time. I also recognize the fact that over the course of the last 12 months, many towns have actually lost their excise taxes. And because they lost their tax revenues, many of them actually had to close down their libraries, or they had to close down their library Wi-Fi systems. And some of the wiser towns decided to close down the libraries, but kept their Wi-Fi on because they knew that there were children who were showing up on the library steps to do their homework, which is telling. And it's also telling that we're talking about the second most digitally evolved country in the world, the largest economy in the world. Just imagine what it is like in other parts of the world far away from where we are. So with that, I'd like to bring this conversation to a close, but really open this up to an ongoing conversation where all of us, continue to reflect on these issues. Do come back to us with any questions, suggestions, and comments. We value the partnership with MasterCard. We value the partnership with Brookings. We value our intellectual partners, across the board. Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Miguel, for joining us, and thank you for being flexible with the time change. We really appreciate this. A few things I'd like to take away. One is President Biden is talking about $100 billion. We know that money is important, but it is not enough. The $100 billion itself is not enough, but even if we did get it, it still won't be enough because there are many other levers that we need to pull. We need to think about opening up the economics of access. And finally, we need partnerships across all the different sectors that we're talking about. And partnerships hinge on one critical thing, which is trust. And right now, we need to build back that trust, to build back better, but also build back trust in the digital system, because we can't do without it. With that, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.